The desert sun had barely begun its climb when I first saw the wagon appear as a distant smear of dust on the horizon. I had counted the days for this moment, scratching the rough wood of my fence post each morning, imagining a single woman stepping down with hope in her eyes, seeking the quiet life I'd long ago built for myself. 6 years of solitude had taught me to value order and simplicity, the rhythm of a life measured by crops, fences, and the slow rotation of seasons. I had not counted on disruption. As the wagon rolled closer, the dust parted and revealed not one, but two figures. Connected, joined at the shoulder in a way that made my stomach twist and my chest tighten. They moved as one yet apart, a delicate, impossible symmetry that no letter or photograph could have prepared me for. My mail-order bride, the woman I had envisioned for months, had arrived in a form I could scarcely comprehend. The driver, a man with eyes constantly scanning the horizon, dropped a small leather pouch onto the dirt and climbed back onto his wagon without a word. The money I had paid sat there, insignificant against the immensity of what I was seeing. The sisters, though I didn't know their relationship yet, stepped down carefully, the weight of their connection evident in every motion. One spoke softly, almost cautiously, while the other remained quiet, surveying me and the barren land around the ranch. Their presence, strangely composed despite the harshness of the desert, suggested survival skills honed by experience I couldn't begin to guess. I realized immediately that my simple, solitary life was about to be upended. Every plan I had made for welcoming a single, shy woman into this remote place evaporated. I had no preparation for two people whose movements required constant attention, and whose very existence defied the limits of what I had considered normal. Yet there was a power in their silence, a knowledge in their eyes that hinted at secrets untold, and a subtle warning that life here, even in its isolation, might no longer be entirely safe. The trunk at their feet contained everything they owned, a small and practical heap that could not capture the complexity of the people who carried it. I felt an unfamiliar tremor of apprehension and fascination as I observed them maneuvering with precise coordination through the doorway of my cabin. It was more than survival. It was a quiet demonstration of adaptability, of resilience, of a life lived under constraints I could only imagine. I poured water from my pitcher into the basin, hands shaking as the weight of the situation pressed down on me. 6 years of careful solitude had taught me routine. Now, that routine was meaningless, and as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the dry earth, I understood that what I had purchased was more than a companion. It was an entire world bound together in ways that challenged my understanding, and it had just arrived at my doorstep. The cabin, which had always felt comfortably empty, suddenly seemed smaller, tighter. Two people moving as one required a careful awareness I had never needed before. Simple gestures, a step to the side, a turn to avoid the furniture, became exercises in observation and timing. I watched them navigate my world, their movements precise, deliberate, almost rehearsed. One sister, the one who spoke first, moved with purpose and confidence. The other lingered slightly behind, eyes scanning the room, silent but attentive, her presence both protective and vulnerable. I realized quickly that nothing in my isolated life had prepared me for the logistics of caring for two women bound together in such an extraordinary way. Chairs were useless. My single bed suddenly seemed inadequate. Even the act of sharing a meal required a new choreography. I poured water, set plates, and tried to anticipate their needs, but every routine I had mastered over 6 years demanded reconsideration. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, and the sisters remained calm, patient even, as though accustomed to adapting in ways most people could never imagine. There was a strange elegance in their synchronization, a harmony that felt almost unnatural. And yet, beneath that quiet order, I sensed tension, an unspoken history pressing against the walls of my cabin. They had traveled hundreds of miles to reach this place, unscathed, which suggested skills, resilience, and experience far beyond their apparent youth. I fed the animals mechanically, barely noticing the rough texture of my hands against the wooden fence, all while observing the sisters. One moved forward to inspect the livestock, her fingers brushing against the coarse hair of the horses, softening each interaction with a care that spoke of prior experience. The other remained near the cabin, eyes constantly alert, scanning the horizon as though expecting threats that I had never feared. I felt my heartbeat quicken, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. 6 years of isolation had taught me self-reliance, but now I was suddenly accountable for the lives of 2 people whose survival depended on careful coordination, vigilance, and my willingness to adapt. Even in silence, the sisters communicated with each other seamlessly, a silent language I could only begin to guess at. And as the afternoon light began to stretch across the dry earth outside, I understood that the quiet life I had sought was gone. In its place was complexity, challenge, and an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. I realized, with a mixture of apprehension and fascination, that this unexpected arrival had shifted the very axis of my existence. By the second morning, the practical challenges became unavoidable. Feeding the livestock, once a simple routine, turned into a test of coordination. One sister would guide the chickens into the pen while the other adjusted the gates, their movements perfectly synchronized yet subtly complicated by their connection. I found myself constantly repositioning, offering hands, moving obstacles, and anticipating what they could not easily do alone. Even the simplest task, carrying water from the well, became a careful choreography of timing, strength, and trust. I began to notice the subtle differences in their personalities. The sister who spoke first approached each task with efficiency and pragmatism, moving with a quiet confidence that suggested prior experience in harsh conditions. Her twin, if I could call her that, though their physical connection made them unique, was more hesitant, observant, and deliberate, measuring the space around them as if every step could be dangerous. The contrast between them created tension, an underlying current that I could neither ignore nor control. Meals were a challenge. I set the table, placing 2 plates side by side on the counter, only to realize they couldn't sit. They hovered, balancing their weight carefully, sharing space in a way that forced me to rethink everything I had taken for granted. One ate efficiently, swallowing bites quickly, while the other picked slowly, her movements almost contemplative, eyes scanning the cabin as if searching for hidden threats. I ate in silence, unsure when the meal was truly over, watching them navigate the smallest details of existence with a precision that left me both impressed and intimidated. Even in these early hours, I sensed that their arrival was no mere coincidence. Their presence carried the weight of secrets, and though neither had spoken of danger, I felt it in the way their eyes darted to the horizon, in the subtle tightening of muscles as they moved through my cabin. The desert, which had once promised peace, now seemed filled with invisible hazards. I realized that the life I had envisioned, a solitary man finding simple companionship, was not going to unfold as planned. I was no longer preparing for a quiet household. I was entering a complex, delicate existence that demanded vigilance, patience, and a careful understanding of 2 lives intertwined in ways I could barely comprehend. By mid-morning, I started noticing details that didn't fit the story they had presented in their letters. One sister, Clara, as I had learned from the sparse envelope they'd brought, handled tasks with an efficiency that suggested more than simple frontier experience. Her hands, rough but precise, knew the way to mend tools, adjust harnesses, and repair fences with minimal instruction. The other, Violet, moved differently. Her gaze lingered on the animals in a way that suggested intuition, a knowledge of behavior that surpassed any casual work on a ranch. She was silent, but every glance and gesture carried meaning, a language I had yet to understand. Their synchronized movements hinted at training, practice, even survival techniques that were foreign to me. As I watched them work, I felt the first stirrings of unease. Something about their arrival was not purely coincidental. They had traversed hundreds of miles through harsh terrain, uninjured and unharmed, and yet there was a tension in the way they flinched at sudden sounds, the way they checked doors and windows, small habits that spoke of past dangers. Even their conversation, or lack thereof, was strange. Clara spoke sparingly, offering practical comments, while Violet remained mostly quiet, her attention scanning the environment and occasionally meeting my eyes with a questioning look that suggested mistrust, caution, and a hidden story. I had expected adjustment, awkwardness, perhaps timidity. What I hadn't expected was the sense that these women carried invisible burdens, remnants of hardships that had sharpened their survival instincts to an edge I didn't yet understand. As noon approached, the reality of caring for them, and sharing space with them, settled heavily on my shoulders. Every step required calculation. Every simple action, from pouring water to lifting a bucket of feed, became a negotiation between their physical limitations and their unique coordination. Yet there was something else beneath it all, a confidence born from necessity, a resilience forged in circumstances I could only guess at. I realized that whatever their story, it had not ended at this ranch. Their past had followed them here, quietly, subtly, shaping the way they interacted with me and the world around us. And as I set about preparing the afternoon chores, I felt a creeping awareness that this life, the one I had dreamed of in solitude, would never be simple again. By the third day, I could no longer ignore the tension lurking beneath their calm composure. Clara and Violet moved through the cabin and yard with practiced efficiency, yet subtle signals betrayed past traumas. Clara's hands trembled slightly when a branch snapped outside, and Violet's eyes flicked to the horizon with an intensity that suggested she recognized dangers invisible to me. There was a story behind their silence, something far more complicated than shyness or reserve. Their belongings were sparse, yet deliberately organized. Each item seemed carefully chosen for utility, not comfort, as though they had learned to survive with minimal resources. I noticed faint marks on their arms, subtle bruises that could have been accidents, or remnants of a life less kind. My unease deepened as I realized that these women were not merely strangers seeking peace. They carried experience and scars that hinted at secrets I had not anticipated. Late that afternoon, while repairing a section of fence near the corral, I glimpsed movement on the distant ridge. 3 figures on horseback paused, watching the cabin with deliberate patience. My heart quickened. The sisters froze, their bodies taut with tension. Violet's hand gripped Clara's arm, and for the first time, I saw fear so raw it made the desert heat seem insignificant. Their reactions were instantaneous, coordinated, and precise, indicating training, or perhaps past encounters with people who posed serious threats. I knew then that their journey to my ranch had not been merely an escape from loneliness or city life. They had come here to hide, or to survive. The isolation that had once been my sanctuary suddenly felt fragile, exposed. And yet, there was no panic in their movements, only a quiet, controlled readiness. They had survived much more than a simple frontier hardship, and whatever danger approached had already been anticipated in ways I could only guess at. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the desert, I found myself weighing the reality of our situation. 3 strangers, myself included, thrust together in the vast wilderness, each carrying burdens hidden beneath the surface. And I realized, with a mixture of fear and determination, that the life I had imagined for myself would now be shaped by the secrets and survival instincts of 2 women who had endured more than I could fathom. The next morning, the ridge was empty, but the unease remained. I had no idea who the riders were, or why they had watched us, but Clara and Violet moved with a vigilance that left no doubt. They had faced threats far more dangerous than an isolated rancher could imagine. As they went about chores, I noticed subtle signs of their prior life. The way Violet assessed the horse's reactions, noting even the smallest discomforts, and how Clara double-checked every latch and lock, her fingers running over metal with practiced certainty. That afternoon, while repairing a gate near the barn, I asked Clara quietly about their journey. Her eyes flickered toward Violet, and I realized some stories were shared in silence. She spoke cautiously, revealing fragments. Years of traveling, performing for paying audiences, lives lived under watchful eyes, contracts that bound them to strangers, and a desperate need for freedom. It was clear now that the letters I had received had been carefully crafted to protect me from the full truth, but also to protect themselves from revealing too much. Violet remained silent as usual, but I caught the way her eyes followed the horizon, how she reacted to every distant sound. There was no doubt. They had been hunted before. Their coordination, their alertness, was born from necessity, honed by repeated exposure to danger. The realization hit me hard. I had imagined a quiet companionship, perhaps awkward at first, but simple. Instead, I had invited two women into a battle for survival, a battle that might not stay distant. By evening, the ridge reappeared, this time closer, and my stomach tightened. 3 riders, patient and deliberate, seemed to be waiting, testing us. Clara and Violet instinctively moved back toward the cabin, their motions silent but urgent, a dance of survival that I was suddenly part of. My rifle felt heavier than ever in my hands, the weight of responsibility pressing down. These were not simple visitors. They were hunters seeking what belonged to someone else, and now, by circumstance or choice, we were caught in the middle. As night fell, the cabin felt impossibly small. The women whispered quietly to each other, a language I could barely decipher, and I lay on the floor, feeling the fragility of our situation. For the first time in years, solitude offered no protection. My ranch was no longer mine alone. It had become a refuge for fugitives, and a battlefield waiting to erupt in ways I could not yet predict. The following day, I realized that waiting passively was no longer an option. The ridge had been watched, the silence was heavy, and Clara and Violet's instincts demanded action. I began planning defensively, thinking in ways I had never imagined, positioning obstacles, checking sight lines from the cabin, arranging corners where I could retreat or gain leverage. My mind, long accustomed to routine and isolation, now raced with tactical possibilities. Clara moved with quiet authority, instructing me through gestures and subtle nudges, while Violet's eyes remained fixed on every point in the distance. They didn't speak much, yet I felt the coordination between us growing. Each task became a careful collaboration, closing windows just so, stacking firewood to obscure line of sight, ensuring the animals were out of danger without drawing attention. I was no longer simply the rancher. I was part of a team trained by necessity, facing an unseen but unmistakable threat. Every creak of a floorboard or gust of wind made my pulse quicken. I watched the horizon constantly, searching for movement. Clara's hand brushed mine occasionally, guiding me without words, and I realized the subtle power in their presence. A calm born of experience and survival, a quiet courage that pulled me from fear into action. Violet, usually so silent, began pointing out small signs I would have missed. A disturbed clump of dirt, a glint of metal, the way shadows moved across the ground. By nightfall, the first shots of movement came, distant but deliberate. The ridge was active. I had to decide, wait behind the cabin, rely on the high ground, or attempt to lure the watchers into a trap. Clara's steady gaze encouraged me to act. Violet's silent appraisal confirmed the danger. Every instinct I had developed over 6 years was useless here. Survival required adaptation, coordination, and trust in these women who had arrived as strangers but had quickly become the only allies I could count on. The firelight flickered across our faces that night, and as I prepared the cabin for a long vigil, I understood something fundamental. This was no longer about loneliness or companionship. This was about defending lives, securing freedom, and trusting instincts honed by pain and experience. And in that quiet, tense darkness, I realized that whatever came next, we would face it together, or not at all. Dawn broke cold and sharp, the desert wind carrying a thin line of dust across the ridge. I saw them first, 3 mounted figures approaching deliberately, their pace slow but purposeful. Clara and Violet stiffened instantly, moving to block the cabin entrances, their coordination silent but precise. Every instinct I had honed over 6 years of solitary ranch life screamed that this was no ordinary encounter. This was calculated, organized, and dangerous. I positioned myself near the corral fence, where I could use the terrain to my advantage. Rocks, ditches, and sight lines I had memorized over years became tools for survival. Clara moved to the cabin window, scanning, while Violet adjusted the animals, ensuring nothing would betray our presence unnecessarily. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, yet oddly familiar, like the calm before a storm I had been expecting but could not fully comprehend. The riders circled slowly, their eyes measuring the cabin, my land, and most likely, the women inside. They were not random travelers. Their precision suggested professional pursuit. My pulse quickened, but I forced calm, remembering every lesson of observation, patience, and timing. Clara whispered directions in gestures, guiding me as we prepared for confrontation. Violet's hand lingered briefly on mine, not for comfort, but as a signal. This was real, and we were ready. The first shot rang out from the ridge, not aimed at us, but testing, measuring our response. Instinct took over. I fired, using rocks and shadows as cover, forcing the closest rider to halt. Clara and Violet moved in perfect unison, shifting positions with deliberate coordination that mirrored training I could only guess at. The attackers underestimated us. Their approach assumed we were a single man in a lonely cabin, not 3 interconnected, highly alert humans ready to defend ourselves. By midday, the standoff had escalated into a calculated dance of aggression and defense. We used the terrain, our knowledge of the cabin, and each other's instincts to remain unseen and unpredictable. Every movement, from a flicker of the eyes to a step across the cabin floor, was a signal, a part of a choreography of survival. I realized, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that these women, once strangers, now allies, had changed the entire equation. This was no longer my battle alone. It was ours, and the price of failure was unthinkable. By mid-afternoon, the riders had drawn closer, their movements more aggressive, their patience thinning. I could see the tension in their posture, the way their hands hovered near their weapons, and I understood that negotiation had ended. Clara and Violet moved with a precision that both comforted and unnerved me. The way they shifted together, blocked pathways, and anticipated each other's needs, their silent communication honed to perfection. I had never been part of such a coordinated unit, yet instinctively I matched their rhythm. The first real engagement began when one rider attempted to flank the cabin from the west. I used the corral fence as cover, firing quickly and forcing him to take cover behind a boulder. Clara appeared at the window above, peering through a narrow gap, her presence like a shadow, guiding me without a word. Violet was near the barn, directing the animals and watching the horizon, alert to threats I might have missed. Every decision, every movement, relied on trust and instantaneous calculation. The second rider approached with intent, misjudging the cabin's angles. I drew him into a trap I had been planning, exploiting the uneven terrain and narrow sight lines. Clara signaled silently, and Violet adjusted her stance to prevent surprise from behind. The moment was tense, almost surreal. 3 people working together, each relying on unspoken understanding, moving as if a single organism with 3 distinct minds. I realized something crucial. Survival depended not on brute strength alone, but on the combination of experience, coordination, and sheer audacity. The ridge, once distant and threatening, became a chessboard, and we 3 were improvising the moves with lethal precision. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder, every shot ringing sharply against the walls of my cabin, but none of us hesitated. I had imagined a quiet, solitary life, yet now I felt more alive than I had in years, not because of fear, but because of connection, the raw, unspoken bond forming between us through necessity and trust. By dusk, the riders began to falter, their confidence undermined by the unexpected resistance and strategic advantage we held. Clara and Violet's coordination, paired with my knowledge of the land, had turned the tide. We were no longer passive defenders. We were a force, unpredictable and relentless, a family forged in adversity and necessity. And as the sun sank low, casting long shadows across the desert, I realized that our survival, once uncertain, now rested on the strength of the bond between us, and on the courage we had discovered in each other. Night had begun to settle over the ranch, the desert turning a deep, shadowed blue, when the final movements of the riders became apparent. Their approach was cautious now, deliberate, yet hesitant, their earlier confidence eroded by the precision and coordination we had demonstrated. Clara and Violet were calm, their movements fluid, almost like a practiced routine, though I knew every step carried the weight of life and death. We were a single, cohesive unit, our instincts and trust intertwining. The lead rider, a tall man whose posture suggested authority, moved closer than the others, likely trying to assess our defenses personally. I waited, holding my breath, feeling the heat of anticipation in my chest. Clara's hand brushed mine briefly, and I understood the signal. Now. We had prepared every position, every angle, and the terrain itself had become our ally. Rocks, fences, even the slope of the land worked to channel their movements where we could respond with controlled force. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Shots rang out, echoes bouncing against the ridges. One rider was incapacitated quickly, the other two faltering under the combined strategy and precise timing of our defense. Clara and Violet moved seamlessly, blocking potential advances, guiding my actions without uttering a word. Every maneuver reinforced the unspoken bond between us, a blend of courage, skill, and desperation. When the last rider finally turned and retreated, the silence that followed was almost surreal. The weight of exhaustion pressed against me, yet there was a strange, exhilarating clarity. Our small group had survived a calculated threat through coordination, courage, and trust. We had faced an organized force and emerged not merely intact, but stronger, bound together in ways solitude had never taught me. The ranch, once my haven of simplicity, had transformed into a fortress and a symbol. The three of us, resilient, capable, and unwilling to be controlled or broken. As the desert cooled and stars began to prick the sky, I realized the truth. The life I had imagined, a quiet companionship, was gone forever. In its place was something far more profound. We were no longer just a man and two strangers. We were a unit forged in adversity, a family whose survival depended not on isolation, but on unity. I looked at Clara and Violet, seeing the courage, the history, and the determination reflected in their eyes. And for the first time in years, I felt that the impossible path we had taken together was the life I had truly been seeking all along. Weeks passed, and the dust from the confrontation settled, leaving the ranch transformed, not just in appearance, but in purpose. Clara and Violet adapted with remarkable speed, turning the modest cabin into a functional, comfortable home. Clara's practical skills transformed the interior, organizing supplies, tending to repairs, and keeping meticulous records of livestock and crops. Violet's natural affinity with animals became evident as she diagnosed ailments, calmed skittish horses, and increased the productivity of the ranch in ways I had never imagined possible. Our sleeping arrangements evolved, too, into a system that respected privacy while acknowledging the sisters' unique needs. I built a small addition to the cabin, creating separate quarters connected by a wide doorway that allowed them to move freely yet maintain their space. We were no longer simply surviving. We were thriving. The isolation I had once sought for solitude had become a shield for something far greater, a family forged from shared struggle, trust, and courage. Life returned to a rhythm, though it was far from ordinary. Meals became collaborative, chores a choreography of coordination, and the quiet evenings allowed moments of reflection and connection. The ridge that had once hosted our pursuers was now just part of the landscape, a reminder of the threat we had overcome. Clara and Violet had escaped their past, and in doing so, had brought a vitality and purpose to my life I had not anticipated. Even the nearest neighbors, initially curious and skeptical of our unusual arrangement, came to respect our household. The Barrett Ranch had become a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the power of human connection in its most extraordinary form. I realized that love, protection, and trust could grow in forms beyond convention, and that the life I had dreamed of in isolation had evolved into something far richer, far more meaningful. As winter approached, we settled into our routines, confident in our ability to face whatever challenges might come. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought us together had been the catalyst, but the real story was the bond we had forged, the courage to survive, to protect, and to create a life together. I looked at Clara and Violet, feeling a profound gratitude and admiration. If you enjoyed this story and the journey of survival, courage, and unexpected family, click on the next video to experience another tale from the untamed West. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us bring more unforgettable stories directly to you. Your support keeps these adventures alive.